My name is Joseph Gonzalez, and until 3 days ago, I was the kind of person who would have dismissed everything I'm about to tell you as religious fantasy. At 67 years old, I had spent my entire adult life convinced that death was simply the end, that consciousness ceased when the brain stopped functioning, and that anyone claiming otherwise was either delusional or lying. I held a PhD in theoretical physics from MIT, published dozens of papers on quantum mechanics, and believed that science could explain everything worth explaining. Faith was for the weak-minded, I told myself. God was a construct invented by primitive humans to cope with their fear of mortality. I was wrong about everything. What happened to me on November 11th has shattered every assumption I held about reality, consciousness, and what lies beyond the veil of death. The visions Jesus showed me about the coming days, specifically November 17th through 23rd, have left me trembling with both terror and awe. What I witnessed about America's senior citizens during this critical week will challenge everything you think you know about God's plan for the final harvest. Before I share what I experienced in those 18 minutes of clinical death, I need you to understand who I was. I spent 43 years teaching physics at various universities, mentoring countless graduate students, and building my reputation on empirical evidence and mathematical proofs. When colleagues mentioned anything spiritual, I would politely but firmly redirect the conversation toward observable phenomena. When my late wife Margaret tried to get me to attend church with her during our 38 years of marriage, I would find excuses or suggest we spend our time more productively. Even after Margaret passed from cancer 2 years ago, even when she whispered with her dying breath that she would be waiting for me in heaven, I attributed her words to morphine-induced hallucinations. I grieved her loss deeply, but I never questioned my materialist world. Death was death. Consciousness was merely an emergent property of neural networks. When the brain died, everything that made a person unique simply ceased to exist. That Monday morning started like any other day in my small apartment near the university campus. I was reviewing lecture notes for my graduate seminar on quantum field theory, sipping my usual black coffee, and listening to the morning news discuss various political controversies. The weather was unseasonably warm for November in Massachusetts, and I had planned to take my daily walk through the park after breakfast. I never made it to that walk at exactly 8:47 a.m. While reaching for a book on the top shelf of my home library, I felt a crushing pain explode across my chest. The massive heart attack hit without warning, dropping me to the floor as my cardiovascular system collapsed in seconds. My last coherent thought as a living man was annoyance that I would miss my afternoon seminar. Then everything went black. But that darkness lasted only an instant. Suddenly, I found myself standing above my own body, watching paramedics work frantically over what appeared to be a corpse on my library floor. The detachment was surreal. I felt no pain, no fear, only a profound sense of curiosity about what was happening. From this elevated perspective, I could see my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had called 911 after hearing my fall through our shared wall. The efficiency of the medical response impressed my analytical mind, even as I realized I was observing my own death. Then I felt a pulling sensation, as if invisible hands were drawing me upward through dimensions that defied every law of physics I had spent decades studying. The apartment, the building, the entire city fell away beneath me until I was surrounded by light that wasn't light in any spectrum I understood. This illumination seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, carrying within it a warmth that penetrated deeper than anything physical could reach. That's when I saw him approaching through the radiance. I knew instantly without question or doubt, that I was in the presence of Jesus Christ, though he looked nothing like the artistic depictions I had seen throughout my life. His identity was unmistakable. His eyes held depths that seemed to contain all of creation's mysteries. And when he looked at me, I felt completely known, completely understood, despite every doubt and denial I had ever harbored. "Joseph," he said, and hearing my name from his lips sent waves of recognition through my entire being. "You have spent your life studying the laws that govern my creation, but you never recognized the lawgiver." I found myself able to respond, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking or if he was reading my thoughts directly. "Lord, I don't understand. I never believed. I spent decades arguing against your existence." His smile was gentle but filled with divine purpose. "I know, my child, but I also know the heart behind your skepticism. You demanded evidence because you valued truth above comfort. Now you shall see truth beyond anything your instruments could ever measure." The space around us began to shift and change, reality itself bending to accommodate what I was about to witness. I felt his presence beside me, a comfort that transcended anything I had ever experienced in the physical world. "Watch carefully," Jesus instructed, "and understand what I am about to reveal concerning the days immediately ahead." November 17th through 23rd will mark a turning point that most of my people are not prepared for, especially those who have lived long and accumulated much wisdom. Suddenly, we were standing above what appeared to be the United States, but I could perceive layers of reality that my scientific training had never prepared me to comprehend. I was seeing through buildings, through walls, through the very fabric of space-time itself, witnessing something that would challenge every assumption I had held about the nature of existence. The first vision struck me with overwhelming intensity. I saw millions of senior citizens across America, people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, experiencing something unprecedented during the week of November 17th through 23rd. But these weren't ordinary dreams or age-related confusion. What I witnessed was a systematic spiritual awakening that would begin with America's eldest generation. "These are my faithful servants who have labored long in my vineyard," Jesus explained, his voice carrying both infinite love and urgent concern. "Many of them have been praying for revival, for awakening, for their children and grandchildren to return to me. Their prayers are about to be answered, but not in the way they expect." I watched in amazement as elderly believers across the nation began experiencing supernatural encounters in their own homes during this specific week. Some saw angels standing at the foot of their beds, radiant beings whose presence filled entire rooms with divine light. Others heard audible voices speaking words of comfort and instruction that seemed to come from dimensions beyond human perception. Still others felt an overwhelming presence of peace that drove them to their knees in worship, tears streaming down their weathered faces as they encountered God in ways they had never imagined possible. "Why seniors, Lord?" I asked, moved by the beauty and intensity of what I was witnessing. "Because they have lived long enough to recognize my voice when I speak," he replied. "They have weathered enough storms to appreciate calm waters. They have buried enough loved ones to value eternal things over temporary pleasures. And most importantly, they have less to lose by believing and everything to gain by surrendering completely." The scene shifted, and I found myself observing something that shook me to my core. I saw churches across America during this same time period, but many of them were nearly empty. Pastors were preaching to rows of vacant pews while outside these same buildings. Supernatural encounters were happening in nursing homes, senior centers, and retirement communities that their own congregations had never experienced. "Do you see the irony, Joseph?" Jesus asked, pointing to the stark contrast. "My institutional church has grown comfortable and predictable, focused more on programs than on my presence. But my remnant, my faithful ones who have walked with me for decades, they are still hungry for more of me." I witnessed elderly believers who had been attending the same churches for 30, 40, even 50 years, suddenly receiving divine revelations that their own pastors had never experienced. These senior saints were being equipped with prophetic words, healing power, and supernatural wisdom that would confound the religious leaders of their congregations. "This is the great reversal," Jesus continued, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Those who have been overlooked and dismissed because of their age are about to become my mightiest warriors in the final harvest." The vision expanded to show me specific scenes happening during November 17th through 23rd. I saw an 82-year-old grandmother in Nebraska receiving a vision of her prodigal grandson's exact location and supernaturally knowing the precise words to speak that would bring him home. I witnessed a 77-year-old widower in Florida being filled with such divine boldness that he began preaching on street corners, leading dozens to salvation, despite having been painfully shy his entire life. I observed a group of senior women in a Texas nursing home, praying over their facility and watching as every resident began experiencing miraculous healings that defied medical explanation. "But Lord," I said, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was seeing, "how will people believe these testimonies? Won't they dismiss these experiences as the confused imaginings of elderly minds?" Jesus turned to me with eyes that blazed with holy fire. "This is precisely why the enemy has worked so hard to convince society that age brings confusion rather than wisdom. He knows that my most experienced soldiers pose the greatest threat to his kingdom. But watch what happens when my power flows through vessels that have been refined by decades of faithful service." The next vision left me speechless. I saw these same senior believers performing miracles that rivaled anything recorded in the book of Acts. Wheelchairs were emptied as paralyzed limbs suddenly responded to the prayers of grandmothers who had learned to move in supernatural authority. Cancer cells dissolved under the touch of grandfathers who had finally discovered their spiritual inheritance. Broken families were restored through the intercession of elderly saints who understood the power of persistent prayer. The world has forgotten that gray hair is a crown of glory. Jesus said, his voice filled with righteous indignation. They have forgotten that with age comes wisdom, that with experience comes spiritual authority. Between November 17th and 23rd, I will remind them in ways that cannot be ignored or explained away. I found myself weeping as I witnessed the transformation taking place in the hearts and minds of elderly believers across the nation. Seniors who had felt useless and forgotten were suddenly discovering that their greatest days of ministry were just beginning. Retirement homes were becoming centers of revival. Senior centers were transforming into houses of prayer. Even golf courses and community gardens were becoming venues for supernatural encounters, as God's presence followed these elderly believers wherever they went. "This is beautiful, Lord," I managed to say through my tears. "But why these specific dates? What makes November 17th through 23rd so significant?" Jesus paused, and I could feel the weight of eternity in his silence. When he spoke again, his words carried a gravity that made my spirit tremble with anticipation and holy fear. These dates marked the beginning of the final countdown, Joseph. Not to judgment, but to harvest, not to destruction, but to the greatest revival in human history. And it will begin with those who have the least to prove and the most to give. The visions continued to unfold before me with increasing intensity, each revelation more powerful than the last. Jesus showed me layers upon layers of his plan for the senior generation in America, and I began to understand why he had chosen this specific week for such a monumental spiritual event. Between November 17th and 23rd, I watched as the spiritual realm would become as visible to elderly believers as the physical world around them. They would see angels walking through their neighborhoods, demons fleeing from their prayers, and the glory of God resting upon their homes like a tangible presence that neighbors couldn't ignore. Joseph, Jesus said, his voice carrying the weight of divine urgency, these faithful servants have been in training their entire lives for this moment. Every trial they endured, every loss they mourned, every prayer they whispered in the darkness of sleepless nights has been preparing them for what I am about to release through them. The scene shifted, and I found myself witnessing something that broke my heart and filled me with hope simultaneously. I saw senior citizens who had been written off by society as irrelevant, suddenly becoming the most sought-after people in their communities. Between November 17th and 23rd, their words would carry supernatural power that couldn't be explained by psychology or wishful thinking. Their blessings would manifest immediately in the lives of those who received them. Their prayers would literally move mountains of opposition and impossibility. I watched a 79-year-old man in Oregon who had been mocked by his family for his simple faith suddenly speaking prophetic words over his atheist son. The words struck like lightning, and I saw that son falling to his knees in repentance right there in his father's living room. Within hours of that encounter, the young man was calling everyone he knew, sharing what had happened with tears streaming down his face. I witnessed an 83-year-old woman in Georgia laying hands on her neighbor's dying husband, and life flowing back into his body like electricity. The man's vital signs, which had been failing for days, suddenly stabilized as divine healing power coursed through his system. The doctors couldn't explain what they were seeing on their monitors. I observed a group of senior men in a Montana retirement home praying over their town from their recreation room, and drug dealers fleeing the area as if chased by invisible forces. Within that week, crime statistics would plummet as supernatural conviction fell upon those involved in illegal activities. These are not coincidences, Joseph, Jesus explained, his eyes blazing with divine fire. This is the fulfillment of Joel's prophecy brought to life in your generation. I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your old men shall dream dreams, but these will not be ordinary dreams. These will be visions that reshape reality itself. The vision expanded, and I saw something that made me understand why Jesus had chosen this specific time period. Between November 17th and 23rd, a spiritual convergence would occur that had been building for decades. The prayers of millions of elderly saints accumulated over years of faithful intercession would suddenly find their answer in a single week of unprecedented supernatural activity. Watch closely, Jesus instructed, pointing to scenes unfolding across the nation. See how I have positioned my gray-haired warriors in every city, every town, every community across America. They are my secret weapon against the darkness that seeks to consume this generation. I witnessed nursing homes transforming into centers of supernatural power during this critical week. Residents who hadn't walked in years were suddenly standing and dancing with joy that radiated from their very souls. Minds clouded by dementia were instantly cleared, filled with prophetic insight that astounded medical professionals who had written them off as hopeless cases. Senior centers became gathering places where miracles happened so frequently that news crews couldn't keep up with the reports flooding in from across the country. But what struck me most powerfully was seeing the faces of these elderly believers as they realized what was happening to them during this transformative week. The loneliness that had plagued so many was replaced by an overwhelming sense of divine purpose. The depression that comes with feeling forgotten and useless was obliterated by the knowledge that God had saved their most important assignment for the final chapter of their lives. "Lord," I asked, moved by the transformation I was witnessing, "why has this power been hidden until now? Why didn't these believers experience this earlier in their lives when they were younger and stronger?" Jesus smiled, and in that expression I saw both infinite wisdom and perfect timing, because they needed to learn complete dependency first. Joseph, they needed to discover that their strength comes not from youthful vigor or worldly accomplishments, but from total surrender to my will. A warrior is most dangerous when he has nothing left to lose except his faith and nothing left to gain except my glory. Womb, the scene shifted again, and I found myself observing the response of younger generations to what was happening with their elders during this pivotal week. Some were amazed and humbled, recognizing the hand of God moving through their grandparents and great-grandparents in ways they had never imagined possible. They fell to their knees, begging forgiveness, having dismissed the wisdom that comes with age and experience. But others were offended, even angry, unable to accept that God would bypass them to work through what they considered obsolete vessels. I watched adult children arguing with their elderly parents, accusing them of losing their minds or being deceived by false spirits. The generational divide became a chasm as pride prevented younger family members from recognizing the authentic move of God happening right before their eyes. "This will cause division even within families," Jesus said solemnly. "Children will reject parents. Grandchildren will mock grandparents, and the prideful will stumble over the very miracles they claim to desire. But for those who humble themselves and receive the ministry of my seasoned servants, revival will explode in their hearts with life-changing power." I watched churches across America grappling with supernatural manifestations happening primarily among their oldest members during this unprecedented week. Some pastors embraced what was occurring, recognizing it as a genuine move of God that transcended their theological comfort zones. They stepped aside and allowed their senior saints to lead, ushering in the greatest revival their congregations had ever experienced. But other church leaders, threatened by the loss of institutional control, attempted to suppress these manifestations. They warned their congregations against deception, claiming that such dramatic supernatural activity couldn't possibly be from God. Their pride and need for control blinded them to the very revival they had been praying for. "The religious spirit has always been my greatest enemy," Jesus explained, his voice heavy with sorrow. "It will resist this outpouring because it threatens human authority and man-made structures. But my power will not be contained by denominational walls or theological boxes that limit my sovereignty." The vision expanded to show me the global impact of what would begin in America between November 17th and 23rd. I saw elderly believers in other nations suddenly experiencing similar supernatural encounters. A 91-year-old woman in rural Kenya began healing entire villages through her prayers. A group of senior men in the Philippines started a revival that spread across multiple islands like wildfire. Grandmothers in underground churches in China received visions that led to mass conversions among their very persecutors. "This is the beginning of the final harvest," Jesus declared, his voice echoing with prophetic authority that shook my very being. "And it will be led not by the young and ambitious, but by the old and wise, not by those seeking fame and recognition, but by those who have learned to decrease so that I might increase in their lives." I found myself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was witnessing. The sheer scope of God's plan, the precision of His timing, the wisdom of His strategy left me speechless. These weren't random supernatural events scattered across time. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to reach the most hardened hearts through the most unexpected messengers. "But Lord," I managed to ask, "what about those seniors who don't experience these dramatic manifestations? What about the faithful believers who pray and fast during this week, but don't see visible miracles?" Jesus turned to me with eyes full of infinite compassion. "Every one of my children has a role to play in this final hour, Joseph. Some will work obvious miracles that capture headlines. Others will intercede in secret places where no one sees. Some will prophesy boldly in public squares. Others will love quietly in nursing home corridors. But all will be used according to my perfect plan. The key is not the magnitude of the gift, but the willingness of the heart to be used." The vision continued to unfold, showing me scenes that stretched beyond November 23rd and into the months that would follow. I saw how this initial outpouring among seniors would ignite a spiritual awakening that would eventually impact every age group across the nation. Young people would seek out elderly prayer warriors, begging them to lay hands on their lives and impart whatever spiritual authority they carried. Middle-aged adults would abandon successful careers to sit at the feet of grandmothers who carried fresh revelations from heaven's throne room. This is the great reversal prophesied throughout my word, Jesus said, his voice filled with divine satisfaction. "The wisdom of this world will be confounded by what appears to be foolishness. The mighty will be brought low, and the humble will be exalted beyond their wildest dreams, and it will all begin with those whose society considers past their prime and beyond their usefulness." I watched as the revival that began with senior citizens during that pivotal week spread like wildfire across America and then around the world. But it wasn't the polished professional revival that many religious leaders had expected or planned for. It was raw, authentic, and led by people who had nothing to prove to anyone and everything to give to God. The presence of Jesus intensified around me, and I knew our time together was drawing to a close. The visions had shown me everything He wanted me to see, and now came the crushing weight of responsibility. Here I was, a former atheist who had spent decades denying his very existence, being asked to carry a message that could affect the eternal destiny of millions of people. "Joseph," he said, his voice carrying the authority of eternity itself, "you must return and tell my people what you have seen, especially those who have lived long and feel forgotten by the world. They must know that their greatest hour approaches. Their finest ministry lies not behind them in the past, but ahead of them in the immediate future." I felt that familiar pulling sensation, the sense of being drawn back towards something I couldn't see. Brilliant visions began to fade, but Jesus' words continued to echo through my spirit with thunderous authority. "Go now, Joseph, and tell my people what you have seen. Tell every senior citizen that their finest hour approaches. Between November 17th and 23rd, I will pour out my Spirit upon the aged, and they will dream dreams that reshape nations. Tell them their prayers have been stored up like incense before my throne, and the time of release has come." But before the light completely disappeared, Jesus showed me one final sequence of visions that would haunt and inspire me rest of my days, I saw what would happen in the months following that pivotal week in November. By December 2025, the revival that began with America's seniors had spread like wildfire across every continent. I witnessed nursing homes in Sweden where elderly believers were receiving visions that led to nationwide spiritual awakening. In Australia, grandparents who had been written off as senile were suddenly prophesying with such accuracy that government officials were seeking them out for guidance. Retirement communities in Canada became pilgrimage sites as people traveled thousands of miles to receive prayer from octogenarians who carried unprecedented spiritual authority. "See how I confound the wisdom of this world," Jesus said, his voice growing more distant, but no less powerful. "The very ones society has discarded are becoming my mightiest weapons against the kingdom of darkness." I watched scenes from January 2026 that left me speechless. An 84-year-old former teacher in rural Montana was praying over her small town from a wheelchair. And as her weathered hands moved in intercession, I witnessed demonic strongholds that had controlled that community. Generations literally crumbling. Drug dealers fled the area as if chased by invisible forces. Bars and strip clubs closed permanently, their owners experiencing supernatural encounters that led to immediate conversions. The vision expanded to show me February 2026, revealing the opposition that would arise against this unprecedented move of God. Government agencies were investigating supernatural phenomena occurring in senior communities, claiming public safety concerns. Scientists conducted studies attempting to explain away miracles as mass hysteria or collective delusion. Media outlets ran exposes trying to debunk the testimonies of elderly believers, interviewing psychiatrists who dismissed the experiences as age-related confusion. But what struck me most powerfully was watching how these attacks only strengthened the resolve of the senior saints. An 87-year-old former engineer in California continued healing the sick even as news crews camped outside his retirement home, mocking his claims. A group of grandmothers in Texas maintained their prayer meetings despite threats from local authorities who accused them of practicing medicine without a license. "The persecution will be intense," Jesus explained, "but it will only serve to purify and strengthen my remnant. Those who endure to the end will see my glory manifested in ways that will shock the nations." March 2026 brought scenes that defied every natural law I had spent my career studying. The revival that had begun with American seniors was now affecting elderly believers in every nation on earth. A 92-year-old woman in rural India was raising the dead through her prayers, causing entire villages to convert to Christianity. Overnight, grandmothers in underground Chinese churches were receiving visions that enabled them to stay one step ahead of government persecution while leading thousands to salvation. But perhaps most remarkable was witnessing how these supernatural manifestations were affecting the younger generations. I saw adult children who had mocked their parents' faith suddenly falling to their knees, begging for forgiveness as they witnessed undeniable miracles. Teenagers who had dismissed their grandparents as outdated were now seeking them out desperately for spiritual guidance and prayer. "This is the great awakening that many have prayed for," Jesus declared, his voice echoing with prophetic authority. "But it will not come through the channels that religious leaders expected. It will flow through vessels that have been broken and remade by decades of faithful service." April 2026 revealed something that filled me with both awe and holy fear. The revival had grown so powerful that it could no longer be contained by human institutions. I watched churches across America grappling with elderly members who were operating in levels of spiritual authority that surpassed their pastors. Some congregations embraced what was happening, allowing their senior saints to lead and teach. These churches experienced explosive growth and supernatural manifestations that drew people from hundreds of miles away. But other churches, threatened by the loss of institutional control, attempted to silence their elderly members. I witnessed heartbreaking scenes of pastors forbidding their senior saints from sharing testimonies or praying for the sick. In response, these elderly believers simply left their traditional congregations and began meeting in homes, senior centers, and even public parks. Wherever they gathered, miracles followed. The religious spirit has always been my greatest enemy. Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "It will resist this outpouring because it threatens human authority and man-made systems. But my power will not be contained by denominational walls or theological traditions." By May 2026, the vision revealed governments around the world beginning to view elderly believers as threats to social order. I watched authorities in various nations rounding up senior citizens known to be involved in the revival, claiming they were mentally unstable or dangerous. Public health, elderly believers were being imprisoned for praying for the sick. Yet miracles continued to happen even behind bars. An 81-year-old woman in a federal detention center led her entire cell block to salvation, and then watched as prison guards began experiencing supernatural encounters that led to their conversions. The vision showed me how these persecuted seniors became even more powerful in their confinement. Their prayers from prison cells were toppling corrupt governments and exposing hidden sins in high places. "See how I use the foolish things of this world to confound the wise," Jesus said, his eyes blazing with divine fire. These frail, elderly bodies contain spirits that have been refined by fire and tested by time. The enemy fears them more than any army. June 2026 brought scenes that made my spirit soar with hope. The persecution had backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing the revival, it had spread it to every corner of the globe. Young people who had been indifferent to Christianity were now seeking out elderly believers desperate to experience the supernatural power they carried. Underground networks formed, connecting senior saints across continents. I witnessed a grandmother in South Korea receiving a vision about a specific need in Brazil, and within hours an elderly believer there was led to provide the exact solution. The global body of Christ was functioning as a single organism, with senior citizens serving as the nerve centers of divine communication. "This is the unity I prayed for before my crucifixion," Jesus said, his voice filled with joy. "My people are finally becoming one, transcending denominational barriers and cultural differences through the power of my Spirit flowing through my seasoned servants." July 2026 revealed something unprecedented. The supernatural manifestations among elderly believers had become so widespread and undeniable that even hardened skeptics were being forced to acknowledge that something extraordinary was happening. Scientific institutions that had spent months trying to debunk the miracles were now quietly conducting their own investigations, with many researchers experiencing personal encounters with the divine. I witnessed a team of neurologists studying an 89-year-old woman with advanced dementia. They watched in astonishment as she suddenly became lucid during prayer and began speaking in languages she had never learned, delivering prophetic messages that proved accurate within days. "The wisdom of this world is foolishness to me," Jesus declared. "I will use the simple to confound the learned, the weak to shame the strong, and the old to teach the young what it means to truly live." August 2026 brought visions that filled me with holy awe. The revival had reached such intensity that it was beginning to impact the very fabric of reality. I watched as prayers offered by elderly believers were literally reshaping the physical world around them. Polluted rivers were becoming clean through the intercession of senior saints. Barren lands were producing abundant harvests where elderly prayer warriors had walked. Even weather patterns were responding to their prayers. The light began to fade, and I felt that irresistible pulling sensation drawing me back toward my physical body. Jesus' final words echoed through my spirit with earth-shaking authority. "Tell them their time has come." The gay, Haired warriors I have prepared for decades are about to take their place on the front lines of the greatest revival in human history. Suddenly, I gasped and opened my eyes to find myself back in the hospital room, surrounded by the steady beeping of monitors and the concerned faces of medical staff. 18 minutes of clinical death had passed, but I had witnessed centuries of God's unfolding plan. Every vision, every prophetic word, every supernatural scene was burned permanently into my consciousness. As a former atheist who had spent my entire career dismissing the supernatural, I now carry the weight of an impossible truth. November 17th through 23rd is not just another week on the calendar. It marks the beginning of God's final harvest. And it will be led not by the young and ambitious, but by the aged and wise, the seniors, who society has written off as irrelevant, are about to become heaven's secret weapons. I don't know who you are or where you're watching from, but I know this wasn't coincidence that brought you to this testimony. If you're a senior citizen feeling forgotten or useless, prepare yourself. Your greatest hour of ministry is about to begin. If you have elderly loved ones, honor them because God is about to use them in ways that will astound the world. Thank you sincerely for walking with us all the way to the end of this testimony. The fact that you're still here tells us that something in these words reached you on a deeper level. Now, we invite you to take a simple step that can carry extraordinary weight. Leave a comment letting us know where you're joining from so we can lift your nation up in prayer. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, ensuring you never miss the messages and revelations we bring each day. And above all, share this video with at least 3 people close to your heart. Friends, relatives, fellow believers, because one act of sharing can awaken a soul, rekindle faith, and guide someone back into the arms of God. May the Lord cover you with His blessing and lead you in His truth now and always.